We are so happy to see so many of y'all here, especially because it decided it wanted to snow today. So thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Erica Scott, and I'm the Artistic Programming Manager here at Ford's Theater. Thank you.
And I'm Alex Wood. I'm the Associate Director of Education and Public Programs here at Ford's Theater. And we are so excited to have you here tonight.
Absolutely. Alex and I like to say that we represent the left and right brains of Ford's Theater because there's the arts, since we are an active theater, and then there's the education. I'm the arts, she's the education. And this program is a beautiful melding of those worlds because we are two sides of one coin. And I just love that you all are here to experience this tonight.
A few housekeeping items. Ford's will be taking photos and video this evening, so we kindly ask that you do not. We love an engaged audience here at Ford's, and we fully welcome you to respond with your most authentic selves.
That means y'all can clap, y'all can whoop.
Well, I was going to say, but please save your applause to the end.
Oh, okay.
But respond in all of the ways that you are compelled to do so, please.
Church
And we will be accepting audience questions throughout the program via Slido. So inside your program is a QR code. You can scan that with your phone camera and it'll take you directly to this website where you can submit questions that our panel and our scholars will be able to entertain as the program continues. So feel free to have that out and get your thumbs ready to submit your questions. And following the program, our author, Dr. Christopher Bonner, will be signing books in the lobby. So if you don't have your book already, you can buy another copy at the gift shop. But otherwise, we hope that you'll take advantage of that opportunity to meet Dr. Bonner and join us in the lobby for a book signing.
Before I do this last little bit, I just want to add about Slido. If we don't get to your question, please do not fret. It is just that we have a program planned, and we love the interaction, but we'll make sure that we can grab as many of you all's interactions as possible. So, lastly, it takes a village to do programs like this and make the magic of theater happen. And so we would be remiss tonight if we did not thank our amazing crew, our amazing company, the staff, the team, and everybody that's working frontline and behind the scenes to make this event and events like this possible. Thank you all. We love y'all. We do. And of course, live theater would not exist without you all. You all are key to events like this. Our amazing audience, we thank you again. It snowed today and you all still showed up. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, applaud for yourself. Applaud for yourself. We do hope that you all enjoy this program. We hope that you all share your feedback with us. We hope that you all sign up for our e-news. And we also hope that you all come back for more events like this at Ford's Theater. So without further ado,
please enjoy Written Then, Spoken Now, Remaking the Republic.
Hello, 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 everybody. My name is Chess Jakobs. I'm the Ford's Theater Legacy Commission playwright and author of The American Five. And I'm so excited to be your host. Yeah, okay, you can clap. Yeah, we can clap for The American Five. Thank you, thank you. And I'm so excited to be the host and dramaturg for Written Then, Spoken Now. Very shortly, we will be joined on stage by Dr. Christopher James Bonner, the author of Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship, as well as Dr. Quincy Mills, who is the director of the Frederick Douglass Center for Leadership Through the Humanities at UMD College Park, and a few actors who will be helping us bring this book talk to life. Before I bring out Dr. Bonner and Dr. Mills, I have a question to help us get started. So go ahead, pull up your Slidos. And if you could answer the question, what does citizenship mean to you? I'll really appreciate that because I'll probably share a little bit of that with Christopher and Quincy. But to help us get started with this conversation, I'm gonna ask the actors to come on out. And they're gonna be bringing a lot of these moments to life that we're gonna be looking at. So they'll be playing a variety of different characters, historical figures from within history, and once they get situated, we'll get them ready to go. So yeah, what does citizenship mean to you? Think about it, put that in there. It can kind of be anything, and those answers will start to pop up on my screen. So, like I said, they're gonna be portraying different people throughout the book, and that'll look a little something like this.
What is striking is the role legal principles have played throughout America's history in determining the condition of Negroes.
They were enslaved by law, emancipated by law, disenfranchised and segregated by law. And finally, they have begun to win equality by law.
Along the way, new constitutional principles have emerged to meet the challenge of a changing society. The process has been dramatic, and it will continue.
Just like that. Go ahead, give it a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Craig Wallace, Ayanna Hardy, and Vaughn Mitter for joining us on stage for a wonderful delivery of what was Thurgood Marshall's speech on the bicentennial of the Constitution. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Christopher James Bonner, author of Remaking the Republic, and Dr. Quincy Mills from the Frederick Douglass Center for Leadership Through the Humanities. Thank you for joining us, Quincy and Christopher. I've already asked the audience to share with us what their answer is to this question of what citizenship means to them. But starting with you, Dr. Bonner, and then of course with you, Dr. Mills, can you give the audience a brief overview of your work as a researcher and how that informs how you think about citizenship?
Yeah, so when I started working on this project, I was in grad school, and I knew that I wanted to write about it and try to understand the lives of black people who were free before the Civil War. And when I went into the records, when I started reading what they were saying, I noticed that they were talking a lot about citizenship. And so I went into a class and I said, oh, these people wanted citizenship. And a good friend asked, what does that mean? And when I followed that question, when I started thinking about that, I realized that was the central question of this project. That was the starting point for this work. So I was trying to figure out why it was important for them to call themselves citizens. They often called themselves colored citizens. That was the language they used at the time. And what I realized, what I came to was an understanding that it was meaningful on a couple of different levels. It was important for them personally to say, like, this was their belonging, their place within the country, but it was also important politically. It was a way for them to try to claim rights. And ultimately, what I've argued is that black people calling themselves citizens was transformative for the nation as a whole, for American citizenship as a status.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing from the audience via Slido is that I'm regularly seeing community and belonging, responsibility, and respect show up in these answers. But to give you some specifics, one says that full participation in our democracy in every respect is citizenship. Several of them simply just say the word belonging. Another one says the legal right to a home. One says those to whom all the rights and responsibilities fulfill. So I guess I'm curious kind of like what your thoughts are about the meaning that gets attached to citizenship in the modern context, and then also if you can take us back and tell us, you know, what citizenship was meaning as a concept at the time of its development.
Yeah, I like this. It's interesting because it feels in some ways different from what I see in the 19th century, but it reflects a similar reality. The emphasis on belonging is different. A lot of the actors the people that we're gonna hear about tonight were talking about specific rights, and they were using citizenship in pursuit of specific things. But this belonging feels more, emotional, psychological, and different in some ways. But the reality is, I think what we're seeing is that there isn't a single, simple definition of American citizenship. And when we recognize that that's the reality in the present, there's a history that we can explore that's sort of the cause, the thread that ties the present to an earlier reality. And the reality was that when the Constitution was written, there was no clear definition of citizenship. Citizenship didn't have a clear or concrete meaning. So people talked about things like belonging, but it wasn't clear in the Constitution who could be a citizen. It wasn't clear what rights it entailed, what protections or what obligations it imposed, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity that is essentially written into citizenship from the nation's founding.
Interesting. As we explore kind of like this ambiguity of citizenship, you can also just put things into the Slido. I'll kind of see them if you have questions throughout the talk. I just wanted to let you know that. But bringing it back here, in hearing kind of like that there was no definition in the Constitution, and this was regularly used as a reference point in determining how citizenship was actually actualized for Americans. Can you just tell us a little bit more there?
So I think that the way that I understand this is that what African Americans are trying to do is work toward something more secure, something more stable in terms of their rights and status. So free black folks faced all kinds of legal restrictions in the early 19th century, and to them, the fact that citizenship was uncertain was empowering. Nothing in the Constitution, nothing in American law said that they couldn't be citizens, and because of that, they insisted that they were. And they used that ambiguity to sort of push themselves towards the rights that they felt were essential to them.
Dr. Mills?
So yeah, I think what's interesting is that today, most of us don't really read the Constitution, right? We make these assumptions about what it says and what's in there. And so Chris's point about the ambiguities of citizenship is foreign to many of us, right? And certainly I think when thinking about the North and these uncertainties, when we get to the North, there were many folks, black and white, and certainly black and white folks who were anti-slavery folks, saw the North as this sort of partially free land. And it's really interesting that when we think about Jim Crow, Jim Crow in the post-emancipation period, the antebellum period is actually a moment where that freedom is being contested. It's a moment where Jim Crow actually was born, right? And so this question about citizenship gets worked out in this very moment, right. and this question of freedom.
In the book, you introduce two key people. They are John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish. And for those of us who have not read the book yet, can you tell us about who these two people are and then how their work in the development of American citizenship began?
Yeah, so essentially the problem here is that there is an uncertainty surrounding citizenship, and black folks are trying to create a conversation and push their way into that conversation. In order to do that, they need a vehicle. They need a tool to get their voices out into the public. And so in the spring of 1827, John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish launched Freedom's Journal, which was the first newspaper edited and published by black Americans. And this was a way for them to reach people with their arguments. And it was also, in the 19th century, newspapers were, they had legitimacy. They were understood as like,
How timely.
No. What I mean to say is newspapers were understood as really in like very intentional ways political tools. It was a common way for a party, for a group with a particular ideology to push their ideas out into public consciousness. And so a political newspaper for black Americans in the 19th century was like a way for them to claim a kind of legitimacy. And so that was part of what Russwurm and Cornish were trying to do.
So in establishing this letter, it feels like it's somewhere in the timeline of when we start to see black Americans really seek to establish businesses. They're building institutions. They're taking advantage of infrastructure that exists or that does not exist, and trying to represent their own interests. Dr. Mills, I'm curious if you may be able to tell us about the legacy of that and how it played into the future of black Americans.
Yeah, so this is a moment where black schools are being established, mutual aid organizations, benevolent and fraternal societies, temperance associations, and certainly newspapers, and particularly churches. To come back to newspapers, yeah, they were organs of public voice. They were also businesses, right? And so many African Americans were certainly trying to build these institutions to represent themselves and provide this base in order to sort of combat much of the work that, much of the discrimination that they were facing in the North.
Interesting. So like this ecosystem of black business ownership and self-determination appears to be like widely attached to the state of being an American citizen, or like the development of that citizenship. And then therefore what freedoms and opportunities are available to you at that time. And that's pretty clear given that when Russwurm and Cornish opened what was called the Freedom's Journal, they had a clear statement of purpose, and that sounded a little bit something like this.
Freedom's Journal, March 1827.
The peculiarities of this journal render it important that we should advertise to the world the motives by which we are actuated and the objects which we contemplate.
We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us.
Too long has the public been deceived by misrepresentations in things that concern us dearly.
Too long have others spoken for us. So this goes back to what you were both really saying, kind of like about like this need to create space where they could speak on their own behalf and like the ability to exercise on the behalf of one's own interests. Dr. Bonner, I'm curious if you could give us a little bit more insight to what the public discussion was about the state of free Black Americans at the time.
Yeah, this is the way you frame that is interesting. There is a public discussion about free Black people, but in a lot of ways, free Black people are not part of it. They're not being invited to be included, right? So there are a lot of Americans, powerful white Americans, regular folks who view free Black people as a problem. From their perspective, the default status for African Americans was enslaved. And so once these people are no longer enslaved, what do you do with them? How are they governed, right? And so there's this feeling that you have to find a way to control or constrain these folks. And so some of the people who viewed African Americans in that way, they embraced what was called the colonization movement. And this was a project that was designed to take free Black people out of the country, essentially get rid of this problem and settle them in Liberia and other places, colonies that were created in West Africa.
So even more colonization because we're seeing a group of people as a problem.
Right, yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so most Black folks opposed this.
Right.
They understood that it was essentially a project of racist removal, but it was a pervasive thread in American politics in the 19th century.
Dr. Mills, are you seeing any parallels in recent history with Black Americans making an effort to carve out their own mediums of getting, their points of view out there into the mainstream, whether it's about kind of like colonization or otherwise?
Yeah, I think throughout, from this period on, from the antebellum period on, Black activists would often use newspapers, particularly, right, to carry forth their vision, their understandings of Black political thought. And so Marcus Garvey, for example, Robert Abbott, Robert Williams, Malcolm X, right, they all thought that they needed to have a newspaper to get their particular position to the public. And so this is 20th century, right, a moment of this burgeoning Black public sphere. And so we can talk about this moment in the antebellum period as that same thing, right, where Black folk are getting together and talking, whether it's a newspaper or whether it's on the street, about what was best for them and how racial advancement will actually take place.
Yeah, I like this, thinking about this as conversation, right? Like Black folks getting together and talking. There's this interesting part of what we heard from Freedom's Journal, we wish to plead our own cause. And that word, we, was really powerful. It was a way for the editors to claim a sort of status as representing the people. And that was, it's like democracy in action, right? They are bringing the mass of Black folks' voices out into the public. But there are challenges that come into play when the we, what claims to be the we, feels like it's not representing the ideas or the thoughts of the people more generally.
Yeah, and that I think connects with this large idea of who speaks for Black America, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we normalize disagreement within that we.
Right.
I guess I'm curious too if we can bring it even more modern to around recent times. How might you see a parallel here in terms of because the audience is kind of asking what parallels might we be feeling in this room and kind of who gets to speak for Black people or how we elevate our own voices beyond our marginal discussions in community.
So I think that this is one of the challenges of I don't know life, Black life, Black politics is we shouldn't necessarily look for someone to speak for Black people, right? And I think this is to Quincy's point, right? I think finding spaces of conversation and doing the work to cultivate those conversations, I think is really important. And the best way for a conversation to function is if it comes from a perspective of people who want to speak and be heard, right?
And I think what we see now and what we usually see is young people letting older folks know that no, you don't speak for us. So I think particularly what's happening, the modern day politics, what's going on, particularly in the Democratic Party, is that younger folks are absolutely not, right? The Democratic Party, and I'm thinking about for the Black folks, right, are trying to move out of the party, but of course it's difficult because of the two-party politics, right? But I think, or if you think about the civil rights movement, right? Young folk, actually students, pushed older civil rights activists in ways that they hadn't expected, right? And so, again, who speaks for us? And that, of course, changes. But I think folks usually find spaces to make their voices heard. I think the larger concern is usually is that Black folk, people see black folk as this monolith, and that there must be one person.
Someone
who
should
speaks.
speak.
Someone
Right,
should speak.
right.
But the concern is that white folk, and this is a general statement here, white folks will sort of listen to the one person, right? The sort of Booker T. Washington effect.
Right, sure,
You know,
sure.
that he becomes representative of black people, and so therefore, W.B. Du Bois is concerned, wait a minute now, you don't speak for all of us,
Right.
We have different ideas about what education might be, what black mobility might look like. And
Right.
so it's this constant tug of war of internal black political
Yeah.
discussions, but it's
Right.
alongside this sort of external sense of race relations and power.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about just like how people get their voices out. If we're thinking about parallels, sometimes I'll draw the parallel that like a newspaper in the 1820s was, to draw a bad metaphor now, was like Twitter kind of.
Sure,
in terms of
sure.
like the speed. Like a newspaper was cutting edge in the 1820s. If you could print something every week with a 4-page
Right,
editorial from
right.
somebody, that's the fastest way to get your voice out. And so I think if we think about it that way, we can see, when Twitter was a functioning thing, we can see how useful it was
Yeah.
for a lot of different people
Right.
to get their voices out and to engage in
Right, exactly. Because when
conversation,
we were engaged with Twitter, you were hearing from everybody, right? From
Right.
across aisles,
Right.
you were hearing from leaders in the BLM
Yeah.
movement. You were
And
hearing
right away.
from right away,
Right.
fast
Right.
they like were responding
That's
to each other,
That's
and like thinking about like newspapers in that context. Like
Yeah.
I find history so fascinating. But one of the things is like newspaper really was like it was the Twitter. It was
right,
the
yeah.
medium where a lot of this was happening. So in the book, we learned that in 1829, John Russwurm started to feel differently than Samuel Cornish did. And at this point, he was the sole editor of Freedom's Journal, given that Cornish left to focus on his work as a minister. And in the newspaper, Russwurm announced that he was actually a supporter of the colonization movement.
Freedom's Journal, February 1829.
We have carefully examined the different plans now in operation for our benefit, and none we believe can reach half so efficiently the mass as the plan of colonization on the coast of Africa. We consider it a mere waste of words to talk of ever enjoying citizenship in this country. It is utterly impossible in the nature of things. All, therefore, who pant for this must cast their eyes elsewhere.
So it sounded to me like Russwurm was pretty clear that the citizenship in the U.S. was a lost cause. But, as you clearly identify, there wasn't even a definition of what citizenship was in totality. So how can it be a lost cause? So I'm curious how he could basically make this claim and then come to the conclusion that colonization was the better pathway for Black Americans.
Yeah, it's hard to say, right? We don't know what exactly, again, because what was citizenship? We don't know what exactly Russwurm meant when he wrote this. If we wanted to speculate, we could think he's living in New York and it's 1829. So in 1821, New Yorkers agreed to a new state constitution that said that Black men had to own $250 worth of real estate in order to vote. And there was no property qualification for white men. And so maybe, thinking about specific rights and citizenship, maybe that's kind of what Russwurm had in mind. But again, we don't really know. What I think is interesting, though, what we can see is that that phrase, enjoying citizenship. He seemed to think that something about citizenship made it essential for his happiness. And so even as he's rejecting the possibility of citizenship in the U.S., he's still thinking that ultimately that's how he wants to frame or define his objectives, right? It's around that concept.
One of the audience members said, people will often listen to the person that they agree with the most. And so in bringing that to the context of this here, it's I guess it sounded like he started to feel like he was in an impossible position, right? But I'm curious what about the folks who didn't really agree with this position, right? If he's releasing this in this journal that's supposed to be interjecting into the mainstream on behalf of Black America, right? But there are not people who agree with this course of action. What was that doing to the community at the time?
So certainly I think Freedom's Journal was the first Black newspaper, but it wasn't the only space that Black people were able to talk and to engage and disagree and so forth. At the same time, right, the newspaper was not an internal document, right? And so would indeed Russwurm's views come to speak for all Black people? Russwurm didn't think he was alone, especially since he likely had greater mobility than many other folks. We should also sort of note that Rushworm was born in Jamaica, came to the U.S. at age 8, right? And so, it's quite possible, right, that he simply was not as committed in that kind of way as someone who might have been born.
Like might not have felt the same connection, right?
Not the same connection. But regardless of his position, black readers would sort of form their own positions, right? We can certainly assume that, right? This was the work of everyday black political discourse. It was a discourse about disillusionment and possibilities, right? Which continues in different forms today, for sure.
So after about 2 years, Samuel Cornish had returned to the editorial scene with a competing newspaper called The Rights of All. And in this newspaper, he basically said that he wasn't just writing to dispute Rushworm's claims, but that he actually wanted to be clear to the public that there really was another perspective.
Rights of All, May 1829.
The sudden change in the late editor of the Freedom's Journal in respect to colonization has excited much astonishment. To me, the subject is equally strange as to others. I conclude by saying my views and the views of the intelligent of my brethren, generally, are the same as ever with respect to colonization. As it respects 3 millions that are now in the United States, we think it in no wise calculated to meet their wants or ameliorate their condition.
Now that was really just an elaborate way to say the colonization wouldn't work, and that Rushworm's choice was not intelligent. But there were other writers who were more direct, like a writer in The Liberator in 1831 who said,
Mr. Rushworm says he sees no other home for us than Liberia. I sincerely pray that he may have the honor to live and also die there.
So like, if you can picture this, this is like them going tweet for tweet, right? Like they're releasing articles in journals at each other, and so it's just really the OG version of reality TV, basically. We have a question here from the audience that I'm gonna pull in here. The question is, I wonder why they chose to even fight for citizenship, so this other perspective that's emerging, why they chose to fight for citizenship instead of fighting to dismantle the concept of citizenship in the first place. Just a curious question.
So here's a way to think about this. I didn't get into the weeds so much of the Constitution, but one reason why people chose to fight for citizenship is because while the Constitution didn't define it, it did suggest that it's important. So how much weeds, right? The Constitution mentions citizenship 11 times. One way is as a qualification for president. It says that you must be a natural-born citizen to be president. So it's suggesting that it's powerful. And then there's this really, what I think is important politically, an important clause of the Constitution which says that citizens are entitled to a set of privileges and immunities. So the document is, again, it's not saying what those privileges and immunities are, but it is saying that citizenship is connected to rights. And so we'll get into the question of how people feel about the nation, right? But there's something in the document, in the framework of the government, that leads a lot of black folks to feel like this could be a useful object, right? Citizenship.
Interesting. I want to bring this kind of like to your students, as you are both professors. And Dr. Bonner, when you pose this question to your students, you shared that they focus on a number of different responses. Can you tell us how kind of like this is received, knowing what they know about how long African Americans struggled and still struggle to fight for equality? And I'm specifically interested in how they might respond to this excerpt from the book that comes from the opposing journal Rights for All.
Nothing appears to me more trifling than to talk of repaying to Africa the debt we owe to her by returning her sons to her coasts. I consider that the shortest way to accomplish this grand object is to do her sons justice wherever we find them, educate this oppressed and afflicted people, encourage them in agricultural and mechanical pursuits, and there will be no difficulty in making them good and happy citizens.
Yeah, and this is, I think, connecting back to the question and connected to Quincy, you raised this idea of disillusionment, right? I think a lot of my students, when they receive or when they read or hear that idea that there's no difficulty in making these folks citizens, they're skeptical, right? Because we know from our perspective that there have been hundreds of years, decades and decades of struggle in which black folks are trying to secure equality. So the idea that it's there's no difficulty is absurd, but I think it's that feeling is in some ways shaped, not only by maybe disillusionment in our present, but our understanding of this longer history. And that's a different understanding, a different perspective than that of someone like Samuel Cornish, who's writing in 1829, living in 1829.
And I'm particularly struck by that language of no difficulty in making them good and happy citizens, right? This language of making a citizen, right? Like, what does that mean? Certainly if something is made, something can also be unmade.
Yeah.
Can a citizen be unmade? So it's really striking to me.
Yeah. So I don't, I think often my students, sometimes they'll ask me directly, like, do you think Russwurm or Cornish was right? Do you think that black folks should have stayed or left? And I don't want to opine on that, and I don't ask my students to sort of choose a side. What I want them to do is to make sense of both of those perspectives. Like, I want them to, it's in a lot of ways it might be easy to side with or to understand Russwurm's pessimism, this feeling that black folks can never be citizens in the U.S., but it's just as important for us to understand and to feel why someone like Samuel Cornish felt committed, or why so many other black folks felt committed to remaining in the United States. And to me, there's like an important political lesson there. It's Cornish was convinced that not only was citizenship something that was accessible to him, but there was political power just in his voice. Like, he keeps publishing these newspapers. He keeps going back to that because he feels like that is a tool that he can use and that he has in the United States. And there's I think, a lesson there for us about how powerful it can feel, how empowering it can feel to have a voice in public.
Speaking about having this voice in public, one of the audience questions we just got was like, is calling yourself a citizen a way of telling white people that we are equal and should be treated as equal?
Yeah.
I'm curious about how that...
Yeah, absolutely, right? I think that's I think citizenship at the time and now maybe is often understood as something that's more than freedom, right? It's understood, it's recognized as a particular legal place. And it's not racialized. There's, how do I want to say this? There's a discourse, there's a conversation that happens sometimes around work like mine among historians, and sometimes scholars will say that they're writing a history of black citizenship. And I'm always skeptical of that because I think what you're writing is a history of citizenship and the ways black folks talked about it and used it and pursued it, right? And I think that was the way that my actors, these historical figures, experienced it in the 19th century. They were engaging with a status that they thought would secure their equality alongside others.
Exactly. Dr. Mills, I'm curious about like your work specifically within black economics and financial well-being and how your students might respond to like investment into bolstering black life here in America versus potentially this idyllic unknown life elsewhere as citizens of another land and country.
Yeah, it's concerning to me, right? When you have folks who have money and resources, they're able to elevate their voice, right? And so Rushroom has a newspaper. Yeah. You need money to have the newspaper,
right.
And now you can be the one to talk, right? But for those who don't have those resources, they have to engage in other means, right, to sort of make their voices heard. And so this assumption, right, that one needs resources to make themselves good citizens is something that we see in this period. We see it in the post-emancipation period. The arguments between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Washington said, that folks should stay in the South. Folks should not move. Think about moving, right? So what makes people want to move? What makes people want to migrate? Washington said, no, stay here, right? And prove your worthiness of citizenship. And so if you sort of accumulate a certain amount of resources, then that will automatically come with power. Certainly the folks disagree with that. Here's that, again, the vagaries of black political thought. And so there's fear, I think, surrounding the vagueness of citizenship, because the question was, who would make it clear?
Who's going to define it, right?
Who's going to define it, and do I trust who would define it? And that gets, like, the Constitution is something that gets interpreted, right? And so, I think that was concerning then, and still is now.
Yeah, somebody in the audience just said that citizenship isn't so much about like the what and how, at least, right now, but basically it's like whatever the government is saying it is at the time. So it's like speaking kind of like exactly to what you're saying. So we have an idea of like who some of these key voices are in the book and in this like pursuit of defining American citizenship. Dr. Bonner, I'm curious, okay, maybe not like the full starting five, but I'm wondering if there's anybody from your starting five of people involved in this story that we should talk about.
Yeah, so when we think about and we talk about citizenship, we talk about newspapers, it can feel very like ambiguous and like amorphous kind of thing. And a lot of what I was interested in sort of crafting this book was the more material, like what's happening for folks in their concrete and their day-to-day experiences. And one of my favorite stories from the book is one of those stories, and it begins with an arrest. It's the spring of 1837, and a black man named William Dixon is on his way to work in New York City when he's grabbed by a group of white men. And they grab him off the streets, they bring him into City Hall. They bring Dixon in front of a judge, and they say that he's not Dixon. They say he's actually a fugitive slave named Jake. And they said that Jake had allegedly run away from a slave owner in Baltimore 5 years earlier.
Wow. So in the story, Dixon had the chance, obviously, to like tell his story in front of a judge, and he was insisting that he was William Dixon.
It is hard, Your Honor. It is hard to be thus treated in this land of liberty. I'm an innocent man. I'm a free man. It is hard to be torn from my family and thrust into prison like a dog. I demand justice of Your Honor.
The judge's name was Judge Riker, and he called for a recess to decide the man's fate. The sheriffs took Dixon by the arms to escort him back to his jail cell. The case went on for several days, and Dixon was transported back and forth between City Hall and Bridewell, an old prison nearby where he was being held. Each day while the court was in session, crowds of black people gathered outside. A reporter spoke to a black woman standing outside, wringing her hands and tears flowing from her face.
They will soon get all our husbands and children. God pity us and help us, for there is no pity in man. Where are our friends? Must we be forever crushed and trodden down in this professedly free and Christian land? May God take the colored people all home to himself, where there are none to steal from us our husbands and children.
So we clearly hear the power and conviction in this woman's voice. And somebody in the audience actually just asked us to talk about black women's role, kind of like in this citizenship, which we are definitely going to get, this citizenship conversation, which we're definitely going to get to. But Dr. Bonner, I'm wondering if you can tell us about what it was like outside of that courthouse, and how important was it that the community was galvanized and showing up surrounding this case?
Yeah, I love this question, and the question from the audience as well, because this is William Dixon. I'm framing this as William Dixon's story, but it's also a story about Black New York, about Black men and women in the city. So reports said that there were about 1,000 people gathered outside of City Hall on various days of Dixon's trial. And on one of those afternoons, that crowd, that community, moves into action to defend one of their own. So one day, as two sheriffs are leading Dixon outside of City Hall, the crowd attacked. They rush forward, they start hitting the sheriffs with wooden clubs, and they pull Dixon away. They give him some knives to arm him, and then they essentially run through the streets to try to help him escape. So Dixon flees, he runs away from City Hall, but the people keep fighting outside of the building. There's a judge who runs outside to support the sheriffs, but a black woman jumps on his back. She puts him in a chokehold, and she's holding the judge, and there's a group of other people. Guys start beating him. They tear the judge's robes off, and then they run away too. Right.
Dr. Mills, anything on like how community shows up and engages in all these things that we might not see in these accounts of history?
It speaks to how we speak.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
How do we speak? Sometimes we don't have to say nothing.
Sometimes we have
got
to be about
do
that
something.
action. Exactly.
We have to do something. Physical acts, right, are also a form of speech. And so this is how she spoke, and all the other folks at that moment. Yeah.
And at the time of this case, Samuel Cornish was still working as a newspaper editor and started another paper called The Colored American. See, clearly Cornish was going to find his way to let his opinion be heard, right? And in this paper, he talks about the arrest and the attempt to rescue William Dixon as one of the first things that he covered. And he chose this as the opportunity to condemn the New Yorkers who participated in the demonstration. He said,
Brethren, my heart is grieved at your conduct yesterday. We have an intelligent and efficient vigilance committee who have eminent lawyers in their employ so that everything that can be done for these unhappy victims of our Republican slave system will faithfully be attended to. We must here enter our solemn protest against your going to the courts at all or assembling in the park on the occasion of fugitive trials. You can do no good, but much harm. Your presence and conduct take all respect and dignity from the lawyers. You also degrade yourselves and all others in the least connected with you. Everlasting shame and remorse seize upon those females that so degraded themselves yesterday. We beg their husbands to keep them at home for the time to come and find some better occupation for them.
so like clearly dissenting with misogyny is what we're hearing. Does this mean that he had, or would you say this means that he had a narrow idea of how civil disobedience in general should be actualized?
And this was about respectability, right? That he's suggesting that there was a proper way to dissent, right? It's a very elitist position here, right? How black people are represented and certainly perceived. And this notion, this sort of moment of civil disobedience certainly comes out of the antebellum period for sure, and black activists throughout the late 19th and 20th century would certainly draw on this era. Certainly we know that Martin Luther King would draw on Henry David Thoreau and his 1849, but later here, essay, Resistance to Civil Government, right? And so this point of civil disobedience was certainly, but also this idea that there are multiple ways to resist, right, would be a constant theme in black political thought, right? Martin, Malcolm, Thurgood Marshall, you sort of think through policy, legislation, you go to the streets, and diplomacy, right? I think that would be larger ways that black folks resisted.
Yeah, what Cornish had to say was, so, it's misogynistic, right? It's clear that he just doesn't think women should be involved in politics. And I was thinking about the phrases you use, Quincy. This is about how we speak, right? Cornish had a really narrow vision of, like, how people should speak and also who should be able to speak. And that was constraining and limiting. Part of this, though, just to sort of try to make sense of this perspective, part of this was going back to this idea that there should be, like, one black voice, right? There was a sense in the 19th century that white Americans would look to or look at one black person to represent the race. And so his feeling was like the image of black folks was wrapped up in what any one black person did, right? So he's sort of working with that anxiety. I'm not trying to excuse his misogyny, right? I'm trying to sort of make sense of it and understand this perspective. It's also interesting, though, to sort of think about what Cornish had to say, because as much as he's condemning this riot, he's also reserving his harshest words for the slave catchers, the white folks who were trying to who did arrest William Dixon.
But for Boudinot, Nash, and other petty officers and lawyers who are engaged in Negro catching, we have no respect. Shame on them. The curse of God and the contempt of the civilized world will ever abide upon them, and the grave worms will refuse to eat their rotten flesh.
So I want to turn our attention to women in the movement. And women have been at the core of social movements for generations. This is not new, this is not news. But it should not be surprising that Cornish for him, it was the case that, given the time that they were in and perhaps even purely the optics of women being at the center was potentially part of his concern. What challenge do you think he was having with this alongside that respectability that you were talking about?
Yeah, I think this is part of why I think it's so essential for us to see and to recognize that women were at the center or at the front of this crowd that rescued Dixon. It's interesting to think about the multiple levels of their politics, right? Like they are resisting, they're challenging this system of slavery, but they're also challenging people like Cornish who are trying to prevent them from making themselves heard. The woman who jumped on the judge's back and threw him in the chokehold, her name was Kezia Manning. And we only know her name actually because she was eventually caught and arrested and put on trial. And her experience was awful. The record suggests that she was held in Bridewell, and she got so sick that the authorities decided that she was unfit to stand trial. And so she was eventually released. And this is partly a story about just the horrors of a prison in the 19th century. But it still has to be a story about the fact that she made that choice to help free William Dixon.
She made that choice, and it just gets to the original point of women, not just women being involved, right? You add women and stir, and it's great, right? But she could have simply just said, let him go, release him, right? Please don't go. But no, she actually went to beat his behind, right?
Right.
And that's and it sort of just speaks to women have not always been in the background. Let's be real clear, right? We just haven't listened to them, and so and there's tons of examples here, right? So I mean, yes, you talk about you go to the civil rights movement and say yes, women were organized. Yes, they were, but they were also out front speaking. Right, and arguing and pushing everybody, right? So women have always been speaking, we just haven't listened. And so I think Manning was speaking with her acts in very, very direct ways.
So this was like, as we're hearing clearly, it was like a movement of solidarity and coalition between black men and women. That's just because everybody's black, right? Like we are working together. But I'm curious what we might know further about William Dixon. I recall that he was dragged back to the jail after the attempted rescue, right?
Yeah, so Dixon's trial continued after this attempt at a rescue. His lawyers were still fighting for him in City Hall. He's brought back, he's still facing the judge. And his lawyers start calling witnesses to help them prove the case that this man was free. And some of the witnesses, one of them was a white ship captain who said that he had employed Dixon for several years. One was a black barber from Philadelphia who said that he had known William for 15 years as a free man. And so there's all these folks insisting, agreeing with Dixon that he is free. The alleged slave owner, a man named Walter Allender, had to prove a tougher case because Dixon had run away, allegedly, 5 years earlier. And so the people supporting the slave owner had to say that they could pick out a person who they hadn't seen in several years and identify him as one of, I think, like 20,000 black folks who lived and worked in Baltimore at the time. So ultimately, the judge heard the evidence from both sides, from Dixon's lawyers and from the slave owners. And Dixon sat in jail for 3 months. And then in the end, the judge decided to release Dixon on bail and said that if anyone else wanted to try to claim him as a fugitive slave, there would be a jury trial to decide his fate. And this was a victory for people like Cornish, people who wanted to work through the courts, because the jury was a layer of protection. If the individual judge like Riker is not in charge, if theoretically 12 peers are hearing Dixon's story, then that was productive. That was a victory.
So where did Dixon go from there? After being arrested and tried and held in jail for months, like what life was he returning to?
Yeah, it's a life of uncertainty, a life of danger. So he could still be brought back to court, even if he's going to have a jury look out for him. But he's a free black person living in New York, living in the North. So there's always this risk of kidnapping. Anybody else could find him and arrest him and claim him as a fugitive slave and make this whole process begin again. So there's all these dangers, but I think that the most frightening day of Dixon's life would really have happened after that original arrest. It was a morning when he met a runaway slave from Maryland.
So, a runaway, okay. All right, so he met a runaway slave, and after just being accused of being a runaway slave himself, can you tell us more?
Yeah, so it's a couple years later. It's 1839, and we know about this because Frederick Douglass wrote about it in his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. So Douglass has escaped from slavery in Baltimore, and he goes to New York City, and he later writes about, he remembers this moment, this first day that he spends outside of bondage. He's alone, he's lost, he's wandering the streets of lower Manhattan. And so Douglass is overjoyed when he bumps into a black man he knows, a man that he remembers from Baltimore. He recognized this man. It was Jake.
The fugitive in question was Allender's Jake in Baltimore, but said he, "I am William Dixon in New York." I knew Jake well, and knew when Tolly Allender and Mr. Price made an attempt to recapture Jake and failed. Jake told me all about his circumstances and how narrowly he escaped being taken back to slavery, that the city was now full of Southerners returning from the Springs, that the black people in New York were not to be trusted, that there were hired men on the lookout for fugitives from slavery, and who for a few dollars would betray me into the hands of the slave catchers. He gave signs of a wish to get rid of me and soon left me, as he said, for his work. He was soon lost to sight among the throng, and I was alone again, easy prey to the kidnappers if they should happen to be on my track.
So what we just heard was Frederick Douglass revealing that William Dixon was in fact a fugitive slave, a man named Jake who escaped from Baltimore despite the man's insistence that he was free. What does this say about the strategies that people had to take to ensure their or others' freedom at the time?
Yeah, so this is a story of multiple kinds of law breaking. So of course there's the mob. There's the riot outside of City Hall that's attacking the sheriffs and just trying to pull Dixon, literally pull him to freedom. But there's also law breaking happening inside of the court. And at the heart of this was a series of lies. So a fugitive slave lies to a judge and says, "I'm William Dixon." A white ship captain and a black barber lie to the same judge and say, "Hey, I know that guy, William Dixon, as a free man," right? There's layers of breaking the law and layers of lies that are working to try to secure one man's freedom.
And I think we have to ask the question, was Jake a lie? Was the enslaved Jake a lie? I think that he really believed that he was William Dixon, the free man, because he never should have been Jake, the enslaved person. And so I think it's important for us to sort of think through the nature of just and unjust laws, right? And this gets back to our discussion about civil disobedience, right? If the law is unjust, and certainly laws are made by men. Men are fallible, and if the law itself is not just, then it need not be followed. And I think that's where that William Dixon probably saw himself sitting.
Yeah, it's tough because there's always, and it's important for us to see this gap between law and justice, but the law, and that's like a political perspective, right? But the law is shaping people's lives in concrete ways. Like legally, a man named Walter Allender had a claim on a man named Jake, right? And so it's like that's part of his reality, right? So I think that part of what's happening here is this process of Jake, I would say, trying to make a new self, right? Yes, trying to create himself in the midst of circumstances that are like constraining who he could be, right? The nature of the law of slavery, whether it's the lie of Jake, if we want to see it that way, or the truth of that law, the nature of that is that it's trying to put him into a box. And he's sort of breaking out of that and constructing this William Dixon person. Yeah.
In the decades following, so we get, a massive expansion of slavery in the Deep South, domestic slave trade, publication of radical anti-slavery texts, like the Douglass autobiographies, strict fugitive state law, and slave law of the 1850s designed to prevent enslaved men and women from building lives outside of bondage. I'm wondering, kind of like with all that contextualized, is there a specific moment in in black social and economic development that comes to mind when you think about those decades that followed and how Black Americans had to navigate the law as they envisioned a different life in the country.
Yeah, when we think about the 1850s, it's like the nation is on the cusp of this crisis, right? There is this feeling, so much of the political discourse is that civil war is coming, and people are threatening secession and posturing in a lot of different ways. One of the things that happens in Black communities in the 1850s is that Black Northerners start creating a series of independent militias. And so this is men in uniforms, armed, trained, marching in like orderly military fashion. We might almost think that they were anticipating that a war was to come. But one of these stories that I think is fascinating is November 1857. A group of Black men who call themselves the Liberty Guard. They meet in Boston and they have their first public parade. And they're decked out in their uniforms, black from head to toe. They're carrying weapons. They're marching through the streets of the city. And it's important that this is like another type or another example of breaking the law. Technically, in Massachusetts, it was illegal for Black men to join a militia or even to create one of their own. But the Liberty Guard, they were doing this. They were violating these controls because they felt like they needed to show themselves in public in this way. It was important for them to claim that space in public.
Sounds like the Black Panthers to me. Right? Like there's a way in which, and they used the Constitution to do it,
Yeah.
right? To
Yeah.
be clear, right? That indeed they needed to show this force of self-defense. There's a long history, frankly, of Black people carrying guns. Those nonviolent civil rights marches that we all talk about, there are also lots of Black folk who had guns who were protecting those nonviolent activists. Most of those folks were Black veterans, right? And so there's a connection between war and guns and self-defense.
Yeah. So like the Liberty Guard was like, a coalition of Black men, but there were actually women supporters of the Liberty Guard. And one of those women that I want to talk about is Sarah Hill. And she gave a speech and presented a flag that had been carried by a group of Black soldiers from the Revolutionary War.
Mr. Commander and officers, your organization presents a novelty in the community in which we live. Under the Constitution of our Commonwealth, you cannot get a charter. But this day has proved that you can exist without a charter. He who would command must first learn to respect himself. This you have shown today. You and your officers have been placed in a position today which required the exercise of great self-control, and you have behaved like gentlemen and true brave soldiers. May you and your command, if ever called to fight for your country, be found among its most foremost and most honored defenders.
So for context, this was a speech that Sarah Hill gave at a celebration that women supporters of the Liberty Guard put on. And so I'm curious for you and from your perspective, what did it mean to have women like Sarah Hill really endorsing this work of these men when these were groups for men and that men were widely participating in?
Yeah, the whole thing about the Liberty Guard, like the public, the sort of out in the street aspect of it was almost like hyper masculine. The story is that they go on their first parade and essentially their display turns into a riot when a group of angry white Bostonians start attacking them, and they're throwing bricks and sort of taunting these men. And so the Liberty Guard, eventually they stop, they sort of break their order, and they turn their weapons on this mob, these angry Bostonians, and they start sort of chasing them away with their bayonets. So this is like this display of their, you might say like valor, but really it's just a display of their manliness, that they're not going to take but so much physical abuse before they turn and give it back. So there's all this way in which they are posturing and performing in public in that way. But what's interesting here is that Sarah Hill is organizing this party, and she's doing what many people would have seen as like women's work, right? Like she's putting together a celebration. It's a ball for the military. But I'm thinking about, Quincy, you said it's not just like you insert women in stir, right? It's not only that Sarah Hill was participating in this political display, she was articulating the logic of the parade, right? The parade was doing one thing, it was making a statement, but she was saying that this is a claim for black equality, and not black men's equality, or not black manliness, right? This is a claim for African Americans' place in the country, and I think that was really important, and it was maybe especially important in the way that she framed some of her comments, right? Hill was really kind of anticipating what would come in the Civil War. There would be this military crisis, she said, and she hoped that when black men took up arms, that they would help to change the positioning of African Americans generally.
And change the positioning this was the moment of freedom. This was the moment that folks had been, screaming about, waiting for, like the potential conflict that could certainly break the change, literally, right? Like this was it.
It's just dawning on me, like right now, that this is basically just 100 years before, the March on Washington happens too, right? And like you saying like this was the moment that people were waiting for too. But I'm thinking from my very modern perspective, like I think about 1963 being like the moment people were waiting for too. So it's interesting to look at those happening 100 years apart there.
Yeah.
In May of 1861, just 1 month into the Civil War, Frederick Douglass printed a letter from a reader in New York who was thinking about what the war could mean for black people.
This present war is liberty making for the first time a decided stand against slavery. In the state of things, it seems to me extremely proper that the descendants of Africans take a prominent part in a war which will eventually lead to a general emancipation of the slave. I think to myself that before we get through the war, every man, black or white, able and willing to carry a musket, will be wanted.
African Americans were anticipating a radical transformation for the United States at the time, but there was nothing to suggest emancipation was coming. In response to this reader, Douglass recognized that black folks were fighting two forces at the same time. But what else is new?
If we are not seen in the present conflict, the fault is not with us, but with our circumstances. For the present, at least, we are between two fires. The slaveholders are willing to take free blacks to fight for slavery, but neither Mr. Lincoln at Washington nor Mr. Davis at Montgomery wants us to fight for freedom. And if we fight, we must fight against the North as well as the South. Abraham Lincoln as well as Jefferson Davis.
So one of the questions I just got from the audience is, how should we consider the idea that black people have been required to earn or kind of like advocate for this status that, and many things that white people have often given to them: freedom, respect, hope, access, citizenship, as we're actively discussing. So I'm curious about, like, from the text we just heard, what did this specific kind of writing, this insistence that the war must involve black people and must move them towards freedom, like, ultimately do? Like, how did that play a role in the broader context of the Lincoln administration strategy at the time, when we think about, black people finding wedges to find their way into this conversation about citizenship in the broader American context?
Yeah. I'm hearing two things, and one is like, what does it mean that folks have to earn this thing, right? I don't know, in some ways it just feels like it's part of what's hard about studying this era, the Civil War era, is recognizing, as we see and as we'll see, there is so much tremendous change, but it required hundreds of thousands of people to die. It required people to literally risk their lives, to take up arms and march in front of rifles and cannons and other enemy soldiers to try to make that change. And I think it's just, I don't know, I think it's really important to emphasize the cost of that change, right? So the politics here, the statements that these folks are making, this was really important for changing the ways that Abraham Lincoln understood the war. The comments like this helped to push Lincoln and other lawmakers to recognize that the conflict was going to be transformative. And so ultimately the policies change from the Civil War as a war for union to a war for liberation. And a lot of that is involving the participation of black soldiers. So starting in late 1862, the government starts accepting black volunteers, and black men are flooding into the service. And this is because they see, and they have seen, the Civil War as a fight against slave owners. And people are like eager, extremely eager to sign up and take part in that fight. By the end of the war, 180,000 black men served in the U.S. military.
There were hundreds and thousands of other people who were eager to march and fight, and those were enslaved people, who once they saw, enslaved folk, once they saw Union troops sort of making their way, they wasted no time leaving the plantation. Those who stayed wasted no time telling the sort of mistress that we ain't slaves no more, right? And so it was actually these hundreds of thousands of enslaved folk, formerly enslaved folk, who were pushing Union camps, right? So much so that Union officers didn't know what to do with them. And so eventually they became contraband of war, right? And this essentially was the other part here, right? That sort of pushed Lincoln to say, okay, we have to act like this is actually about slavery, right? And so there's a way, and historians have sort of talked, I don't know if it's still a debate really, but about who freed the slaves, Lincoln or the slaves themselves.
It's a debate in the classroom.
Debate in the classroom, right? Who freed the slaves, Lincoln or enslaved folks themselves, right? And so so I just wanted to say that like there's other folks who are, and also speaking, right? They're speaking with their feet. They're sort of letting the federal government know that looks, and this is about slavery, whether you want it to be or not.
And that's what I was going to say. It just quickly, it echoes what we've said already, that there's so many different ways to get your voice out, right? Telling a slave owner you're not going to make their breakfast, or writing an editorial to say, hey, Lincoln, give me a gun because I want to shoot a slave owner. It's like these are both politics.
And for historians and amateur historians, sort of students, sort of, in the absence of the artifact, you have to read the act, right? And so if indeed that sort of, that sort of written record is not there, the newspaper, right? What do people do? You have to read the act.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to say the artifact, you see a lot of letters from white slave owners saying, Sarah didn't make my breakfast today. So it's there. The act is in the artifact.
I just want to surface that we're having a very American conversation about citizenship too, right? Like here are like these references that we're making, and like kind of what you're saying about people who were enslaved freeing themselves by joining the military. This is part of like the American emergence of citizenship, right? And in the book, Dr. Bonner, you talk about how African Americans were insisting that this opportunity could transform their lives. Like they were talking about going to war as an act of transformation, and that the war had to be made meaningful for black life beyond just simply the military conflict. And it's clear in several of the references you respond to, including this one from James Jones of the 55th Massachusetts Regiment.
I think, Mr. Editor, that under God, this will yet be a pleasant land for the colored man to dwell in. The declarations of colonizationists to the contrary notwithstanding. Step by step, we are emerging from darkness into light. This is our home and country. As I have said before in a former letter, the world is my country, but I love this part of the world best. Hence, I am in the army fighting for rights withheld, fighting down oppression, fighting for God and the right.
For folks like Frederick Douglass, suffrage was the essential foundation for African American life. In his speech, What the Black Man Wants, he said,
I am for the immediate, unconditional, and universal enfranchisement of the black man in every state in the Union. Without this, his liberty is a mockery. If he knows enough to shoulder a musket and fight for the flag, he knows enough to vote. Shall we be citizens in war and aliens in peace?
we collectively, as African Americans, understood that war wasn't going to change their lives on its own. What mattered was how they could use the war to create change.
Colored Americans have ever been found faithful to the flag, giving to her the whole heart. We ask from her the whole hand. The suffrage of the citizen is the strength of the republic.
The suffrage of the citizen is the strength of the republic. So the suffrage being the strength. And like, it's evident in this claim that the war allowed black people to say in new ways to the United States that it owed them justice. Like, by fighting in this war, you now owe us justice. They had already suffered for the country against their will, but this particular turn in service of the country's development, cutting off enslavement as a core part of the country's economic engine and political power, really gave them a new voice and a new lens in this call for justice. So I'd like to know from both of you, how much were people talking about their rights beyond the ability to fight for the country, as you know we were just hearing after the Civil War, and what did African American service in the Civil War ultimately do for the country, not just for the community?
Yeah, defending the country was considered one of the most ultimate examples of proving one's worthiness of citizenship, right? If you're going to fight for the nation, then damn, why don't you give me the freaking rights? And so we would see this again and again and again, and pretty much every war after that, right? Spanish American War, First World War I, World War II, et cetera, Vietnam. And soldiers, right, would be seen as representatives of black people. And so black people would point to black soldiers and say, they are representing us, they're representing the nation, and so we should all get the privileges and the rights that we are due, right? And so hence the sort of double V campaign during World War II, right? Double victory abroad and victory at home. I think that more than, Civil War service was certainly important. Emancipation broadly brought massive expectations, and you mentioned the March on Washington, right? King would often, in many of King's speeches, he always drew on history, frankly, and he would always reference the Emancipation Proclamation. And so when we get to 63, he liked to recycle his things, right? He didn't have time to write his speeches. So,
right.
He would often sort of reference, not much has changed since emancipation. So emancipation would be this point to measure progress. Because the assumption is, if we're free, then what else we got to talk about?
Right.
Why are we having this conversation if indeed we're in freedom? And so I think there's a way in which Chris's work in the antebellum period provides an early history of that, where African Americans are in the North saying, wait a minute, if we're free, why don't I have my citizenship, right? Complicated, I know you complicate that greatly, but it's quite useful.
Yeah, I think that, the Civil War is often framed as this, it's a starting point for this new question of, what is freedom for the 4 million enslaved people who are liberated during the conflict. So it's the start of something new, but in a lot of ways it's like a new moment for this ongoing, this long-standing struggle, right? And what I think is interesting is that when we draw this connection from, Freedom's Journal through the Civil War era and beyond, what you're seeing is that black folks who are taking up the political struggles of Reconstruction are equipped with the tools that their predecessors have cultivated in the 1820s and 30s and earlier. And so there is change. The Civil War is like a tremendous new opportunity, but it's a new opportunity to take up sort of long-standing struggles. Folks are still talking about what citizenship meant to them. They're still insisting that it was a possibility, and they were still using that language of citizenship and trying to cultivate terms of American belonging that would be meaningful for them.
I want to end this off with one last question from our audience. And we talked a lot about what citizenship meant to people back then, what it was in development. I guess the general question is how does this contextualize the question of what does it mean to be American and what does American citizenship mean today?
So part of it, let me think about Quincy, your point about conversation, right? I think that part of what we see in this context is that I think one of the other comments was that citizenship is what the government says it is, right? But it's not only, right? In the 1820s, so I'm not one of these people who's going to be like, oh, this is the most oppressive time ever, right? The 1820s was horrifically oppressive, especially for black folks, but they found ways to say, no, citizenship is this because this is what we say it is. They found ways to push themselves into that conversation, right? And so even as the government in the 1820s didn't even really take the effort to say that black people weren't citizens. They just sort of ignored them. And now if we're in a position where people of color recognize ways in which the government is trying to push them out of those conversations, actively excluding them, we can look back and see some of the creative ways that oppressed people have pushed themselves into those conversations and made sure that citizenship wasn't just what the government says, right? And I think that's part of this connection that's useful to draw.
Yeah, and I would like to sort of introduce here, I'm always curious to what extent the state, the market, but also human rights sort of fit into these discussions of citizenship, right? And so in the Constitution, there's many moments where it says persons, not citizens, but persons, which suggests that you don't actually
even
have
in the 14th Amendment, right?
Exactly, right? Well, you don't have to actually be a citizen, right, to get certain rights, which is something that we're talking about today, right, in our current moment, right? Or, having a certain amount of money, right, to sort of be a citizen, or is it something that the state just says you're a citizen and you're not, right? So the extent to which the market, the state, and humanity fits into these understandings of citizenship, and I think the folks that you're talking about, they err on the side of humanity, right? Like, what do you, we're going to define what citizenship means because, damn it, I'm here, and I deserve all the rights that are due to me to make me happy, right?
So it's like citizenship is incredibly important, past and present, but it's also not the only way to define or to secure some sort of position that's going to be sustainable and good in terms of securing what people need.
This concludes Written Then Spoken Now, a book talk on Remaking the Republic by Dr. Christopher James Bonner. Dr. Bonner and Dr. Mills, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to our wonderful actors, Craig, Ayanna, and Vaughn, for helping bring these historical figures to life. And thank you to all of you in the audience for coming, asking your questions, learning, discussing with us. I'm sorry that we were not able to get to everything, but buy the book and you can get a lot of your answers in there. We'll have a book signing out in the lobby, and Dr. Bonner will be signing some of those books, so please join us out there. There will be house managers to show you around. Once again, I'm Ches Jakobs. This is Written Then Spoken Now at Ford's Theater. Thank you so much.